Hey guys. Tonight, we drift softly into the shadows of the ancient world. Tonight, we are going to walk the marble pavements of Rome, not as conquerors, but as those who watch the sun set on their own empires. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these quiet journeys into the past. And please, comment down below where you are listening from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who is awake with me in the quiet hours. Settle in. Pull the covers up a little higher. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. Tonight, we explore the heavy, golden silence of the captured queens of Rome. We often hear of the legions, the shouting centurions, the clash of iron on shields. But tonight, we are listening for softer sounds. The rustle of silk in a stone cell. The clinking of golden chains that were made not to adorn, but to bind. The whisper of wind through the curtains of a litter carrying a woman who once ruled nations, now traveling toward a city she has only known as a distant, terrifying rumor. We are going to wander through the stories of women like Zenobia, Cleopatra's sister Arsinoe, and the tragic Sophonisba. We will look at what happened when the shouting stopped and the long, slow years of captivity began. It is a story of psychological weight, of dignity amidst humiliation, and of the strange, complex mercy of Roman mercy that was often colder than the blade. So, close your eyes. Imagine the scent of pine and dust. The air is cooling as evening falls over the 7 hills. Our story begins not with a battle, but with the silence that comes after. To understand the fate of a captured queen, we must first understand the Roman mind. To the Romans, a king or a queen was a creature of almost mythical danger. Rome had expelled its own kings centuries before, casting them out into the mist of legend. So, when a Roman general looked upon a foreign queen, he saw something exotic, something terrifying, and something that had to be tamed. But the punishment of a queen was rarely simple execution. That was to quick. That was to forgotten. Rome needed memory. Rome needed the living, breathing proof that the world had bent the knee. Imagine, if you will, the moment of capture, the realization that the palace walls, which had always seemed so high and so safe, have been breached. For many of these women, the first punishment was simply the jarring transition from the sacred to the profaned. A queen in the ancient world was often also a high priestess, a figure closer to the gods than to common men. Her feet might never have touched the bare earth. Her voice might never have been raised in anger, for a whisper was enough to command an army. And then the Roman soldier enters. The rough hands, the smell of unwashed wool and garlic and sweat, the harsh Latin barking orders that she does not understand. The first punishment is the loss of the self. She is stripped of her regalia, or perhaps, more cruelly, forced to wear it in a way that mocks her former station. She is loaded onto a cart, or placed on a ship bound for Italy. Imagine the journey. It is slow. The Mediterranean is vast and blue, and the ship creaks with the rhythm of the waves. For a captive queen, this journey could take months. Months of sitting in a small cabin, or on a deck exposed to the spray of the sea, watching the coastline of her home disappear. It is a time of suspension. She is no longer a ruler, but she is not yet a prisoner in Rome. She is a ghost in transit. She wonders what awaits her. She has heard stories of the Tullianum, the dark, damp dungeon beneath the Capitoline Hill. She has heard of the Gemonian stairs. But the reality of Roman punishment was often far more subtle and far more lingering than mere darkness. Let us drift first to the story of a queen who refused to let Rome take her at all. Her name was Sophonisba. She was a Carthaginian, a woman of high nobility, caught in the violent, swirling tides of the Second Punic War. She was not just a pawn, she was a player, a woman of immense education and charm, said to be able to sway the hearts of kings with a single conversation. Her story takes us to the dry heat of North Africa. The dust is red here, and the sun is a relentless ice staring down from a pale blue sky. Sophonisba had been married to a king named Syphax, but when the tides of war turned, she found herself in the city of Cirta, waiting for the Roman ally, Massinissa, to arrive. When Massinissa entered the palace, he found her there. She did not cower. She did not run. She stood amidst the household gods of her husband, the incense still burning, the smoke curling lazily into the rafters. She fell at his knees, but not to beg for her life. She begged for her agency. She told him that she knew the nature of Rome. She knew that Rome loved to parade its captives, to make them walk through the streets, while the mob jeered and threw flowers and refuse. She told Massinissa that the only thing she feared was falling alive into the hands of the Romans. Massinissa, moved by her beauty and her noble spirit, and perhaps remembering that he had once loved her, before the war twisted their paths, promised her protection. In a moment of impulsive, romantic madness, he married her right there, on the very day he captured her, hoping that by making her the wife of a Roman ally, she would be safe from Roman chains. But Rome is jealous. The Roman general Scipio, a man of ice and iron, heard of this marriage. He sat in his tent, the canvas flapping gently in the desert wind, and he shook his head. He told Massinissa that the spoils of war belonged to the Senate and people of Rome. Sophonisba was a spoil of war. She had to come to Italy. She had to walk in the triumph. Massinissa knew he could not fight Rome. He went to his tent, heavy with grief. He could not save her life, but he could save her dignity. He called for a servant, a trusted man who carried the king's poisonous small vial, cool to the touch, perhaps made of glass or polished stone. He sent it to Sophonisba with a message. He told her that he had tried to keep his promise of safety, but the only way to keep his promise of freedom was this. Imagine Sophonisba receiving this cup. The room is quiet. The sounds of the soldiers outside are muffled by the thick tapestries. She holds the vial. To us, this seems like a horror, but to her, in that moment, it was a gift. It was a key. It was the only way to slam the door in Rome's face. Livy, the historian, tells us she looked at the servant and said, "I accept this wedding gift. If this is all a husband can offer his wife." She said it without weeping. She said it with the calm of a queen who knows that her final command is to her own body. She drank the poison. She did not tremble, and in doing so, she punished Rome. She denied them the spectacle. When Scipio heard the news, he was furious, but also, grudgingly, admiring. They gave her royal funeral, there in the dust of Africa, but her spirit had escaped. She never saw the cobblestones of the Appian Way. She never heard the roar of the Forum. She remained, forever, a queen of Carthage. But not all were so lucky as to escape the journey. That leads us gently to another queen, a woman whose name is often overshadowed by her more famous sister. We drift now to Arsinoe, the younger sister of Cleopatra. We are in Egypt now. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of the Nile mud. The politics of the Ptolemaic dynasty are a tangled nest of vipers, and Arsinoe was a viper with small, sharp teeth. She had fought against Julius Caesar. She had declared herself queen of Egypt while Cleopatra was aligning herself with the Roman general. But Arsinoe lost. The siege of Alexandria ended, and she was taken. Imagine the humiliation of the younger sister. She is barely a woman, perhaps in her late teens. She is loaded onto a ship bound for Rome. Unlike Sophonisba, she has no poison. She has only the long, rocking voyage across the sea, knowing that at the end of it, Caesar is waiting. When she arrived in Rome, the city was in a frenzy. Caesar was celebrating for triumphs, for massive parades to honor his victories over Gaul, Pontus, Africa, and Egypt. Arsinoe was the jewel of the Egyptian triumph. Now, pause with me for a moment. Let us visualize the Roman triumph. It is loud. It is incredibly loud. Trumpets are blaring, bronze horns that shake the chest. The wheels of wooden carts rumble over the stones. The air is filled with the smoke of burning incense, meant to cover the smell of blood and unwashed bodies, but creating a cloying, heavy haze. Arsinoe was forced to walk. She was not in a cage, but she was bound in chains, and not iron chains. The Romans, in their cruel theatricality, often bound royal captives in chains of gold. Imagine the weight of that. Gold is heavy, denser than lead. To have golden shackles on your wrists and ankles, clinking with every step, dragging you down as you try to walk upright with the dignity of a Ptolemy. It is a physical manifestation of the idea that your wealth has become your prison. She walked through the Campus Martius, past the Circus Maximus, winding her way toward the Temple of Jupiter on the hill. The crowds were lining the streets, leaning out of windows, climbing on rooftops. They were there to jeer. They were there to spit. But then, something strange happened. The Roman mob, this beast of 1,000 heads that usually craved blood, looked at Arsinoe. They saw a girl, a young girl, a princess, struggling under the weight of gold, her eyes wide with the terror of a world she did not understand. She did not look like a monster. She did not look like a threat. She looked like a child. A hush rippled through parts of the crowd. The cheering faltered. Plutarch tells us that many in the crowd wept. They felt a sudden, sharp pang of pity. This was dangerous for Caesar. A triumph was meant to glorify the general. But if the crowd sympathized with the victim, the general looked like a bully. The psychological punishment had backfired. Rome, for a fleeting moment, saw the humanity in the queen. Because of this reaction, Caesar could not execute her. It was tradition to strangle the captive leader at the end of the triumph, in the dark damp of the Tullianum. But the mood of the crowd saved Arsinoe. Instead of the garret, she was granted a strange, liminal existence. She was exiled. They sent her to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in what is now Turkey. Imagine the transition. The noise of Rome fades, replaced by the quiet sanctuary of a temple. She was alive, yes, but she was a queen without a country, a sister without a family, living on the charity of a goddess. She lived in the shadow of the marble columns, listening to the chants of the priests, walking the gardens where the bees hummed in the lavender. It was a gilded cage. She was free to walk the temple grounds, but she knew that Rome's eyes were always open. She was a loose end, and as we know, in the Game of Thrones played by Rome and Egypt, loose ends are eventually cut. Years later, at the request of her sister Cleopatra and her lover Mark Antony, soldiers would come to the steps of the temple. The sanctuary of Artemis would be violated. The quiet exile would end in blood. But for those years in between, Arsinoe lived in the strange half-light of the spared prisoner, a woman who had walked the streets of Rome in golden chains and survived, only to wait for the echo of that walk to catch up with her. As the sun dips lower over the forum, casting long, purple shadows across the marble, our story drifts to the most famous captive queen of all, or rather, the one who famously refused to be captured. We must speak of Cleopatra, but not of her life. We must speak of the punishment Rome had prepared for her, the punishment she denied them. Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, wanted Cleopatra. He needed her. He had defeated her navy at Actium. He had driven her and Antony back to Alexandria. But a dead queen is just a corpse. A living queen, walking in chains behind his chariot, is legitimacy. He wanted to parade the whore of the East, as the propaganda called her, through the streets of Rome to prove that the corrupt, luxurious East had been tamed by Roman virtue. When Octavian entered Alexandria, there was a quiet, desperate negotiation. He sent messages to her. He was polite. He was calm. He promised her life. He promised her that her children would be treated well. He spoke with the soothing voice of a man who holds all the cards. But Cleopatra was a student of history. She knew about her sister, Arsinoe. She knew about the king of Judea, Aristobulus. She knew that Roman mercy was a performance. She tested him. She tried to seduce him with words, with wit, with the remnants of her grandeur. But Octavian was cold. He kept his eyes on the floor, or looked past her. He only wanted the trophy. The punishment Rome intended for Cleopatra was specific. They commissioned a painting of her. This is a detail often forgotten. Before she was even captured, they were already painting her defeat. They wanted to display her as a drunkard, a sorceress, a woman undone by her own excess. They wanted to strip away the intellect, the multiple languages she spoke, the efficient administration of her kingdom, and reduce her to a caricature of Oriental vice. When she chose the aspor, the poison in the hairpin, or the ointment, however she did it, she was stealing Octavian's climax. The silence of her mausoleum, the two handmaidens dying beside her, the arranging of her diadem. This was her final act of statecraft. When Octavian's men broke down the door, they found her dead on a golden couch. Octavian was said to be furious. He sent for the silly, men famous for sucking venom from wounds, hoping to revive her. Imagine the frantic scene. The Roman soldiers, usually so disciplined, now desperate to breathe life back into a corpse, because that corpse was the centerpiece of their victory party. They failed. Cleopatra had escaped. But Rome would not be denied its show. And here is where the Roman obsession with punishment becomes truly bizarre. Since they could not have the queen, they made an effigy. In Octavian's triumph, there was no living Cleopatra. Instead, a statue of her was carried through the streets. A wax or wooden figure, perhaps painted to look like it was dying, with a model of an asp clinging to its arm. The crowd cheered for a door. They jeered at a piece of painted wood. It was a hollow victory, and everyone knew it. The atmosphere of that triumph must have been strange as celebration of a ghost. The punishment was intended for a woman, but in the end, it was Rome that was left wrestling with a shadow. But let us move away from the famous names for a moment. Let us drift to the north, to the cold mountains and the dark forests of ancient Britain. Let us speak of Cartimandua. Her story is different. She was a queen of the Brigantes, a powerful tribe in northern England. She did not fight Rome. She allied with them. She saw the legions marching north, saw the straight roads cutting through the ancient woods, and she made a calculation. She would keep her power by bowing her head. For years, she ruled as a client queen. She grew rich on Roman wine and Roman coin. She even handed over the rebel leader Caraticus to the Romans in chains, an act that earned her the hatred of many of her own people. But the punishment of a collaborator is a slow, grinding isolation. Her people turned on her. Her husband turned on her. A civil war erupted in the mud and rain of the Yorkshire moors. Rome had to send soldiers to rescue her. Imagine that rescue. It was not a triumph. It was an extraction. She was pulled from her home, from the lands her ancestors had walked for centuries. She was taken to the Roman fort at Chester, or perhaps down to Londinium. We do not know when she died, and that, in its own way, is a terrible punishment. To be a queen who is forgotten, she vanishes from the history books. She likely lived out her days in a Roman villa, safe, warm, perhaps drinking wine from a glass goblet, but utterly irrelevant. She became a pensioner of the empire. She watched the rain fall on the Roman tiles, knowing that in the hills of the north, her name was a curse word. Rome did not kill her. Rome simply absorbed her, digested her power, and left her to fade into the grey mist of anonymity. From the grey, rain-swept hills of Britain, our journey drifts south and east, back toward the sun. The mist clears, and we find ourselves standing in the golden light of the Syrian desert. We are moving toward the story of Zenobia, the queen of Palmyra. If you listen closely, you can hear the wind whistling through the colonnades of her city. Palmyra was an oasis, a jewel of trade, a place where the cultures of Rome and Persia mixed in a swirl of incense, silk, and spices. Zenobia was not just a queen, she was an intellectual, a warrior, a woman who claimed descent from Cleopatra and equaled her in ambition. She dared to call her son Augustus. She dared to strike coins with her own face. And for a brief, shining moment, she ruled an empire that stretched from Egypt to Turkey. But Rome does not tolerate rival sons. The Emperor Aurelian, a soldier emperor, a man of discipline and leather, marched against her. The war was hard. The desert was unforgiving. But eventually, the walls of Palmyra were breached. Zenobia fled on a camel, racing toward the Euphrates River, hoping for sanctuary in Persia. But she was caught. Now, Imagine the moment of her capture. It was not in a palace, but on the banks of a river, the water lapping at the reeds. The dust of the chase was still settling. She was brought before Aurelian. He did not kill her. He looked at this woman who had defied the legions, and he saw the centerpiece of his coming triumph. Zenobia's punishment is perhaps the most famous example of the Roman theater of humiliation. She was brought to Rome in the year 74 AD. The city was in a fever of celebration. Aurelian was celebrating a double victory over the Gallic Empire in the west and Palmyra in the east. Zenobia was the star, but the Romans did not just want to show her. They wanted to crush her with the very symbol of her power, gold. The historians tell us that she was bound in fetters made of pure gold. A golden chain around her neck, golden shackles on her wrists, golden rings on her ankles. Close your eyes and try to feel the weight of that. Gold is soft, but it is incredibly dense dotted drags. It digs into the skin. She was also draped in her finest jewels, rows of pearls and heavy gemstones sewn into her purple robes. The weight was so immense that this warrior queen, who had ridden with her cavalry and marched miles with her troops, could barely walk. She had to be helped. A slave, or perhaps a Persian buffoon, cruel addition by the Romans to mock her court walked beside her, holding up the slack of the golden chains so she wouldn't collapse in the dust of the Via Sacra. This was a specific psychological torture. It was Rome saying, "You loved wealth, you loved power. Here, wear it all, wear it until it breaks you." She walked for miles. The noise of the crowd was a physical wall of sound. They shouted her name, not in adoration, but in spectacle. Zenobia, the Queen of the East. She had to keep her head high. She had to look at the temples of the gods who had failed her. She had to look at the balcony where the emperor stood, the man who had burned her city. But here, the story takes a turn into the quiet, strange mercy of Rome. After the triumph, after the noise died down, and the flower petals were swept from the streets by the night cleaners, Zenobia was not strangled. She was not thrown into a dungeon. Aurelian gave her a villa. It was in Tivoli, just outside Rome. It was a beautiful place, near the famous Hadrian's villa. Imagine the scene. A Roman country estate, surrounded by cypress trees that point like dark fingers to the sky. Fountains splashing in the courtyards. Mosaics on the floors depicting hunting scenes or the seasons. Zenobia, the queen of the desert, became a Roman matron. It is said she married a Roman senator. Her children grew up speaking Latin, wearing the toga. She lived out her days in peace. But ask yourself, as we drift through this quiet garden, was this a mercy, or was it a different kind of punishment? To be tamed, to be domesticated, to look out from her terrace, sipping Roman wine, and remember the wild, hot wind of the Syrian desert that she would never feel again. She became a curiosity. Visitors would come to dinner and whisper, "That is her. That is the woman who fought Rome." And she would smile, a polite Roman smile, her fire extinguished by comfort. She vanished not into death, but into the banality of a comfortable life. Rome swallowed her whole, and she became just another brick in the wall of the empire. Let us leave the sun-drenched gardens of Tivoli and travel north again, to the deep, tangled forests of Germania. The air here is cold and smells of pine resin and damp earth. We are looking for a woman named the Snelda. Her name is less famous than Cleopatra or Zenobia, but her tragedy is just as deep. She was a noble woman of the Carusi tribe. Her husband was Arminius, the man who had betrayed Rome, the man who had destroyed 3 Roman legions in the Teutoburg forest. To Rome, Arminius was a monster, a traitor, the ultimate boogeyman. The Snelda did not fight. She was pregnant when she was captured by the Roman general Germanicus. Her own father, a man named Segestes, who was an ally of Rome, handed her over. Imagine the betrayal, to be given to the enemy by your own father, while carrying the child of Rome's greatest enemy. She was taken to Rome. The year was 17 AD. It was the triumph of Germanicus. Tacitus, the historian with the sharp, cynical pen, describes the scene. He tells us that while other prisoners wept and begged for mercy, the Snelda walked in silence. She did not cry. She did not plead. She clutched her son, a toddler by now, named Thumblicus. Imagine the mother and the child. They are surrounded by the trophies of her husband's victories, captured Roman standards, painted scenes of the battle in the forest. She is walking through the very heart of the beast her husband had wounded. The punishment here was not just for her. It was a message to Arminius, far away in the German woods. Rome was parading his wife and his son. They were saying, "You may have defeated our legions, but we have your future." After the parade, the golden chariot of the general turned up toward the temple of Jupiter, and the prisoners were led away. The Snelda vanishes from history's gaze into the shadows of captivity. We do not know when she died, but we know a fragment of the fate of her son, the little boy Thumblicus. Tacitus drops a chilling hint. He mentions that the boy was raised in Ravenna, a city of marshes and fleets on the Adriatic coast. And he hints that the boy met a tragic end, possibly in the gladiator school. Imagine the cruelty of that irony. The son of Arminius, the great liberator of the Germans, forced to fight for the entertainment of the Roman mob, dying in the sand of an arena, thousands of miles from the forests of his ancestors. The Snelda's punishment was the slow, agonizing knowledge of her son's fate. To raise a child in captivity, knowing he belongs not to you, but to the empire that hates his father. To watch him be molded by the very hands that put chains on your wrists. It is a quiet, domestic horror played out in the rooms of a villa in Ravenna, where the sea fog rolls in and obscures the horizon. The shadows lengthen. The candles burn low. We drift now from individual names to a group of women whose names were never recorded, but whose sorrow was carved into stone. We turn our eyes to the Dacian Wars. Dacia was the land of the Carpathian Mountains, rich in gold and silver, ruled by a king named Decebalus. The Emperor Trajan conquered this land in a war of brutal efficiency, and to commemorate it, he built a column, Trajan's column, that still stands in Rome today. If you walk around that column, winding your eyes up the spiral of marble reliefs, you will see the story of the war. And near the end, you will see a scene that is haunting in its stillness. It shows the Dacian women. They are not fighting. They are being rounded up. The men are dead or fleeing. King Decebalus has slit his own throat beneath a sprawling oak tree to avoid capture. The women are left. The carving shows them with their children. Some are looking back at their burning villages. Some are clutching their infants to their chests. They are wearing the long, heavy dresses of the mountain people, their heads covered in scarves. Their punishment was a mass displacement. They were the root and stock of the nation, and Rome dug them up. Tens of thousands of Dacians were marched out of their mountains and brought into the empire as slaves. Imagine the sound of that exodus, the creaking of ox carts, the weeping of children who are too tired to walk, the line of captives stretching for miles, a river of humanity flowing south across the Danube. For these women, the punishment was the erasure of their culture. They were scattered. A Dacian woman might end up as a servant in a villa in Gaul, or a farmhand in Sicily, or a weaver in a workshop in Rome. She would never hear her own language spoken again. She would never see the peaks of the Carpathians. They became the invisible infrastructure of Rome. They cooked the food, they cleaned the floors, they nursed the Roman babies. Their punishment was to serve the destroyers of their world, day after day, in total anonymity. The Romans had this idea they called civilizing, right? They thought they were bringing people into the light of order. But let's pause for a second and think about what that really meant. Tonight, as we sit in the quiet, let's acknowledge the tragedy that came with that so-called light. It didn't illuminate. It burned away everything these women knew. They're like silent ghosts, always there, standing behind every Roman banquet, pouring the wine, their eyes downcast, their memories locked away in hearts that no Roman ever bothered to know. Now, let's dive a bit deeper. We need to talk about a place where the sun never shines, the Tullianum. You might have heard about it before, but let's take a moment to really visualize it. Imagine descending the Gemonian stairs and standing before its door. This wasn't just any prison. It was the prison of Rome. And it wasn't some grand place with lots of cells. No, it was a small, damp underground chamber at the foot of the Capitoline Hill. Originally, it was a cistern, a water tank, and it was cold. I can almost smell it now, stagnant water, old stone, and fear. Sallust, the historian, described it as disgusting and vile, filled with filth, darkness, and a stench that clung to everything. It's hard to imagine the kind of despair that lingered in that space. While some queens, like Zenobia or Arsinoe, were spared this fate, the threat of the Tullianum loomed over every captive. It was the abyss, a chilling reminder of what could happen. Let's think about one woman who probably experienced a similar darkness, the wife of Jugurtha, the king of Numidia. We don't even know her name, but her story is haunting. Her husband was thrown into that pit, a man who was used to the open sun and the vast desert. When he was lowered into the wet dark, he reportedly laughed and shouted, "By Hercules, this is a cold bath." Can you imagine that? His family, including his 2 sons, were paraded with him, a spectacle of humiliation. After the triumph, while the general went off to sacrifice white bulls, the captives were sent to the prison. For a mother, the punishment of the dungeon wasn't just about her own suffering. It was about the echoes of her children in the dark. The Tullianum was a place of starvation, a place where time stood still. There was no day or night, just the endless dripping of water and the shallow breathing of those waiting for death to come. Rome wielded this darkness like a weapon. They didn't always need the executioner's blade to instill fear. Sometimes, all they had to do was close the lid. They let the cold and hunger do the dirty work. It was a passive punishment, a way for Rome to wash its hands of the blood. We didn't kill them, they could say. Nature took them. The psychological horror of the dungeon is something we can't overlook. Imagine being a queen, a person used to vast spaces, palaces, courtyards, kingdoms, and suddenly having your world reduced to a few square feet of wet stone. It's like dismantling her mind before her body even has a chance to die. It's the compression of a soul, the slow suffocation of hope and identity. So, as we reflect on these stories, let's remember the voices that echo in the shadows. They deserve to be heard, don't you think? It is important to recognize the weight of history and the lives that were lost in those dark places. Each story adds a layer to our understanding of the past, reminding us of the humanity that was stripped away in the name of civilization. From the damp, suffocating darkness of the Tullianum, let us ascend slowly back into the light. But the light of Rome can be as blinding and as cruel as the dark. We drift now to a different kind of punishment, not of chains, but of the heart. We travel to the story of a queen who was not captured by war, but by love, and who found that Rome's rejection was a prison all its own. We speak of Berenice, the queen of Judea. Her story is one of silk and whispers, played out in the highest corridors of power. She was a woman of immense wealth, a member of the Herod dynasty, a political player in the complex world of the Roman East. During the Jewish revolt, she and her brother allied with Rome. She met the Roman general Titus, the son of the Emperor Vespasian, the man who would destroy the temple in Jerusalem. Titus fell in love with her. She was older than him, sophisticated, powerful, a woman who knew the secrets of kings. When the war ended, she followed him to Rome. She lived in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. She was effectively the co-empress. But Rome is a jealous city. The Roman people could tolerate a foreign queen in chains, but they could not tolerate a foreign queen on the throne. They remembered Cleopatra. They whispered in the markets. The poets wrote scathing verses. The senators grumbled in the bathhouses. Another Eastern sorceress, they said, enslaving our noble Roman sons. Berenice's punishment was not a physical cage. It was the slow, icy realization that she would never be accepted. She was the other. She lived in the center of the world, in the arms of the future emperor. Yet she was utterly isolated by a wall of Roman prejudice. The pressure grew to great. Titus, who was known for his charm, but also his ambition, had to make a choice. To rule Rome, he had to reject the queen. Suetonius, the biographer of the Caesars, wrote one of the most famously melancholy lines in Latin history about this moment. Demisit invitus invitum. He sent her away, against his will and against hers. Imagine that departure. There were no soldiers dragging her. There were no golden shackles. Just a quiet conversation in a room with a view of the Forum. The realization that the love of an emperor was not enough to break the iron laws of Roman custom. She had to pack her things. She had to leave the palace, walk past the guards who perhaps looked at her with pity or contempt, and leave the city. She faded back to the east. She vanished from the great stage. This is a punishment of the soul. To be lifted to the very height of the world, to touch the purple robe of empire, and then to be discarded simply because of who you are. Berenice lived for years after, but history stopped speaking of her. She became a ghost in her own lifetime, wandering the halls of her ancestral palaces, remembering the view from the Palatine, carrying the heavy, silent burden of a love that Rome would not allow to exist. Let us leave the heartbreak of the palace and drift north again to the deep, green shadows of Gaul. We are going to explore a story that is hidden in the crevices of history. A story of a woman named Eponina. Her story takes place after the chaos of the year of the 4 emperors, around 70 AD. Her husband, Julius Sabinus, was a Gallic noble who had rebelled against Rome. The rebellion failed. Sabinus was hunted. Most men would have fled to Germany or Britain, but Sabinus could not bear to leave his wife. So, he devised a plan. He burned down his own villa to make the Romans believe he had died in the fire. And then he went underground. Literally, he hid in a cave system, a tomb beneath a country estate. And Eponina, his wife, the noblewoman, went with him. For 9 years, they lived in the dark. Close your eyes and imagine the texture of that life. The smell of damp earth and limestone. The total absence of sunlight. The silence, broken only by the drip of water and their own whispers. Eponina lived a double life. By day, she would sometimes emerge, appearing in the local towns, playing the grieving widow, wearing mourning clothes, weeping for a husband she knew was alive just a few miles away beneath the ground. She fooled them all. She even traveled to Rome at one point, standing in the busy streets, maintaining her charade, all to protect the secret of the cave. In that darkness, she gave birth twice. She raised 2 sons in the tomb. Imagine the hush of that childhood, teaching a child not to cry, not to shout, because a shout could bring the legions. Raising them by the light of a flickering oil lamp, telling them stories of the sun and the sky as if they were legends. This was her self-imposed punishment, a prison built of love. She endured the darkness to be with him, but Rome always finds out. Eventually, they were discovered. The soldiers came to the cave. The family was dragged out into the blinding, painful light of day. They were brought before the Emperor Vespasian in Rome. Eponina stood before the emperor. She had her 2 young sons with her, boys who had grown up in the dark. She showed them to Vespasian. She begged for her husband's life. She said, "I have brought these whelps up in the tomb, so that there might be more of us to supplicate you." It was a heartbreaking plea. The crowd wept, but Vespasian was a practical man, a man of cold logic. He could not let a rebel live, even one who had been a ghost for 9 years. He ordered the execution of Sabinus. And here, Eponina delivered her final defiance. She asked to die with him. She looked at the emperor, sitting on his ivory chair in the sunlight, and she said something that echoes through the centuries. She told him that she had lived more happily in the darkness of the tomb with her husband than Vespasian had lived in the light of his power. She was executed, but in her death, she claimed a victory. She rejected the Roman world. She rejected the light that Rome offered because she found it corrupt. Her punishment was death, yes, but her triumph was that she had created a world as small, dark, loving world that Rome could not touch until the very end. The wind shifts. We move from the darkness of the cave to the fog of the British Isles once more. We must speak of a silence, a terrible, heavy silence that hangs over the end of the revolt of Boudica. We know Boudica, the warrior queen of the Iceni, with her chariot and her flaming red hair. We know she burned London. We know she died, perhaps by poison, perhaps by illness. But often forgotten in the smoke of that war are the two figures who started it all. Her daughters. We do not even know their names. Tacitus tells us that the war began because the Romans violated these two young women. They were the princesses of the Iceni, and when the war ended, when the last British shield wall was broken at the Battle of Watling Street, the daughters vanish. What happened to them? History does not say, and that is a punishment unique to the vanquished, to be erased. But we can drift into the possibilities, guided by what we know of Roman custom. If they survived the battle, they would not have been treated as queens. They were not Zenobia. They were not worth a villa in Tivoli. They were the daughters of a barbarian rebel who had slaughtered thousands of Roman citizens. They likely faced the fate of the anonymous captive. The slave markets. Imagine the trauma of that transition. From the royal house of the Iceni, riding in chariots, wearing the gold torques of nobility, to the auction block. Perhaps they were separated, sent to different provinces, one to work in a mine in Spain, the other to a mill in Gaul. Their punishment was the total loss of identity. They became hands. They became tools. They likely lived out their lives doing backbreaking labor, surrounded by people who did not speak their language. People who did not know that the woman scrubbing the floor had once been the reason for an empire to tremble. This is the punishment of oblivion. Rome took their land, their mother, their dignity, and finally, their names. They are the dust in the mortar of the Roman world, held together by silence. Let us drift now to a different kind of captive. Not a queen, but a child who would become a queen, and whose captivity was a gilded, confusing lesson in Roman power. We speak of the custom of the obses, the hostage. In the ancient world, hostage did not mean a prisoner in a basement with a gun to their head. It was a diplomatic exchange. Kings on the borders of the empire in Thrace, in Judea, in Mauritania would send their children to Rome to be educated. It sounded like a privilege. Come, Rome said, learn Greek, learn rhetoric, watch the games, live in the house of the emperor. But it was a leash. Imagine a young princess, perhaps the daughter of a Germanic chieftain or an African king. She is 5 or 6 years old. She is taken from her mother's arms and sent to Rome. She lives in a marble palace. She eats honey cakes and wears fine linen, but deep down, she knows she's just collateral damage in a much bigger game. If her father rebels against Rome, her life hangs in the balance. She might be killed or simply cast out, left to fend for herself. It's a heavy burden for anyone, especially a young girl. Her punishment, the warping of her soul. Raised to be Roman, she forgets the songs her mother sang around the campfire. The warmth of those memories fading away like smoke in the wind. She starts seeing her own people as barbarians, a term that feels so foreign to her roots. Fast forward to when she's 18 or 20, and guess what? Rome decides to send her back home. Go, they say, marry a king, be our eyes and our voice. It sounds like a fairy tale, right? But when she returns to her homeland, she feels like a stranger. The wooden halls of her father's home seem drafty and primitive, and the customs she once knew feel crude and outdated. She's caught in this weird limbo to Roman for her own people, yet to foreign for Rome. It's like a psychological amputation, really. Rome created a class of rulers who are forever homesick for a city. That's more like a prison to them. It's a brilliant yet cruel piece of engineering, planting a Roman heart in a foreign chest, binding their loyalty to the empire with the tangled roots of childhood memories. As the moon rises higher, casting a silver sheen over the 7 hills, let's dive into the story of a woman who flipped this narrative on its head. Galla Placidia. She was the daughter of Emperor Theodosius and the sister of Emperor Honorius. Born into the highest nobility, her life seemed set in gold. But then, in 410 AD, the unimaginable happened. The Goths, led by Alaric, sacked Rome. The city that had conquered the world was now conquered itself. And when the Goths left, they took Galla Placidia with them, loaded in wagons of gold and silver. Just picture it, this princess of the empire, now walking in the dust behind a barbarian army at just 20 years old. Talk about a shock to the system. She traveled with them for years, moving through Italy and Gaul, living in tents, surrounded by the rough Germanic speech of her captors. It must have been a surreal experience. Right. But then, something unexpected happened. Her captor, the Gothic King Ataulf, fell in love with her, or maybe he respected her noble bloodline. Either way, he married her in a ceremony that was a strange mix of Roman and Gothic traditions. Ataulf donned Roman clothes, and as part of their wedding, he gifted her 50 young men carrying plates of gold and gems, the very plunder they had taken from Rome. Can you imagine the psychology of that moment? She was accepting her own family, their stolen wealth, as a wedding gift from the man who had taken it from her. So, was she a prisoner? A queen? The answer is both. She bore Ataulf a son and tried to bridge the gap between the Goths and Romans, working to civilize her husband. But then tragedy struck. Ataulf was murdered, stabbed in his bath. Just like that, Galla Placidia's protection vanished. The new king, Sigeric, was a brute who wanted to humiliate her. He forced her to walk on foot in front of him for 12 grueling miles, along with other captives. 12 miles in the dust while the Goths jeered and laughed. It was a cruel twist, echoing the Roman triumph, but reversed now. The Roman princess was the trophy, forced to walk with her head down, grieving not just for her husband, but also for her lost child, feeling the blisters form on her feet with every step. Eventually, she returned to Rome and became a powerful figure, serving as a regent for her son. She built stunning churches in Ravenna that still stand today, filled with beautiful mosaics of stars and blue skies. But one has to wonder, when she sat in her palace in Ravenna, listening to the gentle sound of the sea, did she ever remember the dust of that road? Did she recall what it felt like to be treated as a possession, a mere object on display? Her punishment was to witness the fragility of her own world. She saw Rome burn, and she learned that marble can crack. That a princess is only a princess as long as the soldiers with the spears decide she is. Galla Placidia's life is a fascinating blend of tragedy and resilience. She navigated two worlds, constantly shifting between being a captive and a queen. And her story is a reminder of how power and vulnerability can coexist in the most unexpected ways. It's a wild ride, filled with highs and lows, and it leaves us wondering about the true nature of identity and belonging. What do you think? Isn't it incredible how history can show us the complexities of human experience? We leave Galla Placidia there, in her quiet, mosaic-filled rooms in Ravenna, forever marked by the dust of that road. Her story, a story of a Roman becoming the captive, serves as a strange and unsettling mirror. It shows us that the line between conqueror and conquered was sometimes just a matter of a single broken gate, a single moment of chaos. It reminds us that the punishments Rome inflicted upon others, the parades, the humiliation, the loss of home were horrors they themselves understood and feared. From her story, our journey drifts away from the lives of individual women and into the quieter, more abstract methods of punishment. These were the penalties that were not enacted upon the body, but upon the very idea of a person. They were the subtle, grinding tools that Rome used to dismantle not just a queen, but her entire world. Let us first consider the punishment of a name. A name is a powerful thing. It is a root, connecting a person to their ancestors, to their land, to their gods. And Rome knew this. One of the most insidious ways Rome cemented its power was by renaming people and places, erasing the old words and writing its own on top. Imagine a captive princess brought to Rome as a child. Her name might be a beautiful, complex string of sounds that speaks of the wind in her homeland or the deeds of her grandfather. But in Rome, that name is difficult to pronounce. It is strange. It is barbarian. So, they give her a new name, a Roman name, something simple, like Julia, or Livia, or Octavia. At first, she resists. She says her own name in her mind. But day after day, she is called Julia. The other children in the palace call her Julia. The servants, the tutors, her captors, they all say Julia. After a while, the new name begins to stick. Her own name starts to feel like a secret, a memory of a dream. Years pass. When she looks in the mirror, a woman named Julia looks back. The girl with the unpronounceable name is a ghost. This was a form of cultural annihilation. It was a way of saying, your past does not matter here. You begin now, as a Roman. We see this on a grand scale with cities. When Hadrian crushed the final Jewish revolt, he razed Jerusalem. And when he rebuilt it, he did not call it Jerusalem. He called it Aelia Capitolina. Aelia, after his own family name, and Capitolina, in honor of the Capitoline triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. He salted the earth of a sacred name. For a captured queen, seeing her children given Roman names was a unique and terrible torment. She might be allowed to live in a comfortable villa, but her son, who should have been named after a great king of her line, is now called Marcus. He learns Latin poetry. He learns to mock the old gods his mother whispers about in the dark. The punishment is watching your own legacy be rewritten, one syllable at a time, until the connection to the past is severed forever. It is a slow, quiet erasure happening in the sunlit courtyards of a Roman home. From the loss of a name, we drift gently to a deeper loss, the punishment of religion. In the ancient world, a queen was not just a political leader. She was often a spiritual focal point for her people, a high priestess, a living connection to the divine forces that protected her kingdom. Her gods were not abstract beliefs. They were members of her family, residents of her city. Now, imagine this queen, a captive in Rome. The air in Rome smells of different gods. The smoke rising from the temples is for Jupiter, for Mars, for Vesta. Her own gods, the snake goddess of the German swamp, the sun god of the Syrian desert. The mother goddess of the Gallic forest have no temples here. Their names are not spoken. Rome's attitude towards foreign gods was complex. Sometimes, in a practice called evocatio, they would formally invite the god of a city they were besieging to abandon their people and come to Rome, promising them a new temple and greater worship. It was a spiritual bribe, but for the captured people, it was a profound betrayal. Their own deity had packed up and moved to the winning side. More often, the captive queen's gods were simply ignored, treated as minor, rustic spirits. Or worse, they were syncretized. Rome would look at a Celtic god of thunder and say, "Oh, you mean Jupiter." They would find a foreign goddess of love and say, "That is Venus. You just call her by a different name." Think of the cult of Isis, the Egyptian goddess. She became immensely popular in Rome. But it was a Romanized Isis. Her rites were changed. Her meaning was subtly altered to fit a Roman worldview. For a Ptolemaic princess in exile, seeing the processions for Isis in the streets of Rome must have been a deeply strange and alienating experience. It was like seeing a beloved family member wearing a mask, speaking with a different voice. The punishment, then, for a captured queen was spiritual suffocation. She could not perform the rites that her power depended on. She could not consult the oracles of her homeland. She was cut off from the source of her spiritual authority. She might be forced to make token sacrifices to the Roman gods, or to the divine genius of the emperor, an act of profound blasphemy to her own faith. She would walk through the Roman Forum, a place electric with the power of Roman divinities, and feel like a ghost in a city of alien spirits. Her gods were either forgotten, mocked, or co-opted. Her spiritual world, which was once as real and solid as her palace walls, had dissolved into mist. It was a punishment that aimed to unmoor the soul, leaving it to drift in a world where the very heavens had been conquered by Rome. As we wander deeper into these quiet, abstract prisons, our path leads us to the ultimate punishment, the erasure of memory. The Romans had a formal term for this, damnatio memoria, the damnation of memory. It was a decree from the Senate, usually reserved for a hated emperor or a traitor. Their name would be chiseled from every inscription. Their face would be scraped from every public relief. Their statues would be melted down. It was a legal and spiritual effort to make it as if the person had never existed at all. While this formal decree was rarely applied to a foreign queen, the principle was practiced in countless other ways. The victors write the history. For a captured queen, her story was now in the hands of her enemies. They could tell it however they wished. Zenobia was not remembered in Roman histories as a brilliant administrator and scholar who created a cosmopolitan empire of tolerance. She was remembered as an arrogant woman who dared to challenge Rome and was justly humbled. Boudica was not a queen defending her daughters and her people from brutal oppression. She was a wild, hysterical barbarian leading a savage revolt. The punishment was to have your life's narrative stolen. The queen might live out her days in her villa, telling her grandchildren the true story of her life, of her kingdom, of her people's bravery. But the official story, the one carved in stone and written on papyrus, was the Roman version. And the Roman version always won. Think again of the forgotten ones, like the daughters of Boudica or the Queen Cartamandua. Their erasure was not even a dramatic act of damnation, it was a slow, quiet fading. Rome simply stopped talking about them. They were footnotes. Then they were not even footnotes. They were ripples on the water that smoothed out and vanished. This is a terror that haunts all of humanity, the fear of being forgotten. For a queen whose entire identity was tied to legacy and remembrance, it was the final, crushing blow. Rome did not just take her kingdom, her freedom, and her children. It took her story. It locked it in a box, buried it, and built a triumphal arch on top. She could scream her truth into the wind from the terrace of her villa, but the only sound history would record was the tramp of Roman legions and the quiet scratching of a Roman historian's pen writing her out of existence. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, back where we began, in the strange, sunlit prison of Roman mercy. We have walked through the dark of the Tullianum and the dust of the Triumph. We have seen the golden chains and the poison cup. But perhaps the most profound punishment of all was the one that looked like kindness. The villa in Tivoli, the comfortable exile, the pension from the emperor. This was the masterstroke of Roman psychological warfare. By sparing a queen, by giving her a life of comfort, Rome disarmed her legacy. A queen who is martyred becomes a symbol. Boudica, the fierce warrior queen, dying in defiance, remains an enduring icon of British resistance, right? But let's think about this for a moment. A queen who accepts a Roman pension. Picture her growing old in a beautiful garden, marrying a senator, and watching her children become Romans. That's a different story altogether. She's no longer just a symbol of resistance. She morphs into a symbol of Roman generosity. Her tale shifts from a narrative of defiance to a chapter in the grand saga of Rome's greatness. It's like Rome could boast, "Look how merciful we are. We conquered her, and then we offered her a life of peace." It's a clever way of taking down a queen without shedding a single drop of blood. Instead of a dramatic end, they smothered her power with comfort. It's heartbreaking, really. It robbed her of a noble ending and stripped her of the dignity that comes with a final, defiant act. Imagine her not as a lioness roaring in a cage, but as a declawed house cat, purring on a soft silk cushion while her kingdom was dismantled and forgotten. That quiet, comfortable captivity, it was the ultimate theft. It stole her anger, her grief, and her power to inspire others. Zenobia, the fierce warrior, became Zenobia, the Roman matron. The fire that once terrified an emperor was reduced to a gentle warmth, just suitable for a dinner party anecdote. The punishment wasn't just chains. It was the comfort that made you forget you were wearing them. It was a slow, gentle, and utterly complete absorption of a vibrant life into the vast, unyielding machinery of the Roman stator final. Quiet act of consumption that felt more like a betrayal than a victory. as we wander these shadowed paths of Roman captivity tonight. We listen for the whispers in the ruins. Can you hear it? The clinking of golden chains, the silent weeping in the gardens of exile. We see that the punishment of a captured queen was rarely a simple act of violence. Instead, it was a complex and patient art, a slow dismantling of a soul. It was the weight of gold, the erasure of a name, the silencing of gods, and the terrible, suffocating kindness of a comfortable cage. Think about the stories of these women: Zenobia, Arsinoe, the Snelda, and so many others whose names have been lost to time. They remind us that behind the grand tapestries of empire, the marble statues, and the triumphal arches, there are quiet, human heartbreaks. Their stories echo the truth that the end of a war isn't just an event, it's a long, slow echo that continues for a lifetime, reverberating through generations. Now, the old city is quiet. The moon hangs high over the broken columns of the Forum, casting a serene glow over everything. The ghosts of these queens can finally rest. The weight of their crowns and their chains is lifted at last. The wind whispers through the cypress trees of Tivoli, carrying not tales of triumph, but a soothing lullaby of peace. Thank you for joining me on this reflective journey through these halls of memory tonight. If you found our quiet exploration enjoyable, I'd absolutely love it if you liked and subscribed for more stories that help you drift away. And hey, drop a comment below. I'm curious where you are and what time it is in your corner of the world. Settle in now. Let the last of these echoes fade and sleep well.